Hello everybody, so it's 9:15 on Tuesday and I'm back again to do a live feed on my Good Enough Mum page. I'm doing this every Tuesday, so you'd be very welcome to come and join me if you're free on Tuesdays. So I don't know if you've seen, but I did a live feed on Saturday where I was talking a bit more about why it's important as mums that we look after ourselves. And when I watched the feed back, I sort of realised that there was something missing, because I talked about the importance of looking after ourselves for the sake of our family. But actually, I think it's really important for us to look after ourselves for our own sakes, because we're important in our own rights. So I've got some notes here and I'm just going to refer back to them. But I wondered sort of how many of us really believe that we are good enough by ourselves, in ourselves, or how many of us only believe we're good enough because we've got to do something to help other people or look after other people. We look for what we achieve in order to measure our worth. How many of us are okay in believing that we are enough, whatever we do, even if we don't look after anybody, that we're just important enough because we're here and we are important in our own rights. So I'm just going to refer back to my notes because this is such an important message. You know, for example, I think as mums, we quite often, we define ourselves in terms of how well we're looking after our children. You know, we define ourselves by our caretaking role, and we don't actually believe that just as women, we are actually good enough. So what I'd really like to think about is, what if we are actually good enough? We tend to sort of think that because we're not very good, we've got to sort of show everybody that we're worth something. But what if, instead of thinking that we weren't very good, what if we turned that on its head and thought that we are good enough? One of my inspirations in my counselling journey is the work of Carl Rogers. And Carl Rogers is he's one of the sort of gurus of the counselling world. And he talks about that we don't start from the fundamental point of thinking that people are bad. We don't really define people as to whether they're good or bad. What he suggests is that people just have an inward ability to grow. And you'll see that I've titled this video, Growth is Messy. And I think that's so sort of a helpful way to think about ourselves. Because with Carl Rogers, what if we turn things on its head? Instead of going around thinking that, people are evil, people are bad, what if we just thought that people were okay, that we're okay, and that we're just doing the best that we can? Carl Rogers likened people to, he actually initially studied in agriculture, and he likened people to being a bit like plants that grow, that if you expose them to the right conditions, they're going to grow. But because people have an innate desire and ability to grow, it doesn't really matter what conditions they're in. And this explains why quite often bad stuff happens in the world, because of the conditions that people are given in the world. So if you think about this is a potato, right, that I've had in my vegetable rack. You can see it's sort of starting to sprout, and it's a bit sort of messy, but it is actually growing. That's what the potato is supposed to do. And I think it's really important to think about the context in which we grow, and this quite often can explain why things happen and why sometimes we find ourselves perhaps reacting in ways that we don't wish to react, because we've grown up in particular conditions, and sometimes those conditions aren't particularly good for us. I hope this is making sense. So can we think about ourselves as, instead of being someone who's inherently bad, can we think of ourselves as someone who's grown up, with all sorts of different conditions upon us, and that's made us react in certain ways, and that sometimes we can be reactive because we're actually hurting as well. and that's quite often what I do with my work with people, is I think about the conditions and the context in which they took particular decisions. And most people actually are just trying to do the best that they can, given difficult circumstances. And that's why I think it's really important for us to think about context. So I think the really important thing to remember for us as people, as mums, as women, is that we're not inherently bad. We are good enough. We do have enough in us to be able to do the best that we can. And if we think about, if we go around thinking that we're bad, that tends to sort of limit us. We tend to be quite grumpy. We tend to feel bad. We look for all the things that sort of prove that we are bad. And we sort of don't try anything. We won't be friendly with people. And so, whereas if we think we are good enough and we feel sort of an inherent okayness with ourselves, I'm not quite sure whether to call it confidence or not, but we feel okay with ourselves, and that tends to make us try new things. It tends to make us a little bit more outgoing, and then we sort of draw in people to that very positive mindset that we've got. But I think it's really important to remember that growth is messy, that growth doesn't always look good. And I particularly, it's one of the things I really enjoyed when I did a self-esteem course, is we looked at what children are like, and children are growing, they're still learning, and so it's an inherently messy process. They will get things wrong. And actually, at what point do we become adults? Are we not all a bit like children? We're still growing and we make mistakes and we're a bit messy. And I think that's such an important thing to remember, that we are messy as well. And recently I've made a mistake in my counselling practice that I've really been sort of very upset about and beating myself up about, because it isn't something that I want to do. I do want to be as good as I can be, but also I have to recognise in that growth is messy. I'm forever growing and changing in my practice, and that means that sometimes I'll get it wrong, and I think this is true of all of us. We're all doing stuff, sometimes we'll get it wrong, but if we can say to ourselves, well, growth is messy, that's okay. And finally, sort of what I'd like to finish with is just thinking about the way we describe ourselves. So thinking about being a mum, I was talking last time about how it's really important that we look after ourselves in order that we can look after our families. But what I really like to think about is that we can look after ourselves not just for the sake of our families, but for our own sakes. And it's not because we've earned the right to look after ourselves. It's not because we're particularly skilled at being a parent. It's not because we've changed the baby's nappies 10 times today, or we've cleaned out 15 bottles, or whatever it is that we sort of think to ourselves, when I've done that, I'll sit down and have a rest. No, we're deserving of a rest. There's a very subtle difference there. It's not because I've worked so hard I deserve a rest, but I am deserving of rest because I am human, and I need to rest as part of looking after myself, because I'm important in my own right. And that's really where I'd like to sort of finish this particular live feed, is just sort of thinking to ourselves, I am deserving of looking after myself. I am deserving of caring for myself because I am human. I really like you to think about that. And the other thing I just wondered if I could ask you is if you've got any comments. If you can think to yourself, how is my growth messy? What are the sort of things that bother you about being a mum, being a parent? What sort of things do you sort of feel is messy? And it'd be really great to get a little thread going where you can sort of just say, what is it, if you were to compare yourself with other mums, what is it about what other mums do that you wish that you could do? So for me, I lived in perpetual mess when my kids were growing up. I never managed to sort out how to keep the house tidy. Some other mums are brilliant at that, but that really wasn't my sort of bag. So if you've got something where you look at other mums and you think, they're so tidy or whatever, well, what's your mess? What's the mess that's going on in your life? And if you'll dare to share, that would be really great, because we can get a conversation going. And the more of us who are able to share our messy growth, I think the easier it is for everybody. Okay, I'll finish there, and I'll see you hopefully next week, 9:15 on Tuesday, over at Good Enough Mums. Okay, thank you. Thanks for watching. Bye.